It started with an innocent evening jog, one of those quiet escapes that became my only time alone. My husband, Eric, was working longer hours, and I convinced myself that these runs kept me sane, but deep down I knew I craved something more. The night I met him, the air was thick and warm, city lights casting long shadows down the deserted streets. As I rounded a corner near the park, I nearly collided with him. A tall, dark-haired stranger with piercing blue eyes that made my breath catch. He was dressed casually, like he'd just come from a workout himself, but something about him felt different, magnetic even. I muttered a quick apology, but he flashed a smile that slowed me down more than anything. "Evening jogger too, huh?" His voice was smooth, somehow calming and unsettling all at once. I nodded, feeling my cheeks warm as I tried to steady my breathing. Not just from the run. We exchanged a few pleasantries, each word lingering between us a bit too long, until he finally asked, "Mind if I join you?" It was so simple, so easy to say yes. He matched my pace, falling in step beside me as if we'd been doing this for years. We talked about everything, and yet I felt like we hadn't said a thing at all. The night ended with a laugh, and just before we parted ways, he introduced himself as Daniel. As I walked back to my house, I could feel my heart racing in a way it hadn't in years. I told myself it was nothing, a silly, harmless encounter that had only added a bit of spark to my evening. But the next night I found myself hoping he'd be there again. And he was. Over the next few weeks, our encounters became routine, though they were anything but ordinary. We'd run, talk, laugh, sometimes just sit on a park bench watching the city lights flicker as people hurried past. I told him things I hadn't told anyone, not even Eric. I shared secrets, fears, dreams that felt neglected and abandoned. Daniel listened, his gaze intense and unwavering. His words always seeming to hit the exact spot in my heart that had been longing for validation, for excitement, for something more. Each night, I'd return home to my quiet house, my husband already asleep or distracted with work, and I'd feel torn between the life I had and the one I was beginning to imagine. Daniel and I never crossed any lines at first. It was all just words, stolen glances, the occasional touch when he'd help me stretch after our run or guide me through a busy intersection. But I could feel the tension building like an inevitable storm, one I both feared and desperately wanted. The night everything changed, we'd stayed out far later than usual. The city hushed in its midnight calm. I was supposed to be home an hour earlier, but neither of us had seemed willing to end our night. We wandered to a quiet part of the park, shadows hiding us from view, and he finally reached for me, pulling me close, his touch electric and almost overwhelming. It wasn't until I felt his lips on mine that I realized how far I'd already fallen. The kiss was slow, consuming, a mixture of every unspoken feeling we'd shared over those weeks. I felt alive, as if something in me had been waiting for this exact moment to break free. After that night, everything changed. We no longer met just for runs. Our nights together were filled with secret rendezvous, long drives, and stolen hours that I'd lie about later. Daniel became my escape, my thrilling secret, and I was so deeply entangled in his world that I barely noticed how distant I'd become from Eric. The guilt was there, but I pushed it down, burying it under the excitement and passion that Daniel stirred in me. But something started to feel off. Occasionally, I'd catch him staring at me with a strange look, as if he were studying me, reading into my every movement. He'd ask questions that felt oddly specific, about my life, my marriage, things he'd have no reason to know about. He was too attentive, his gaze too knowing, but every time I questioned it, he brushed it off with a casual laugh or a change of subject. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe this was just the thrill of being caught, a guilty conscience surfacing. Then one evening, as I was leaving his place, he reached for my hand, holding it just a moment longer than usual. He looked at me and his smile was sad, almost regretful. "I need to tell you something, but you're not going to like it," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart pounded in my chest, fear mingling with the adrenaline that always came from being near him. I waited, feeling my throat go dry as he sighed, finally speaking words I'd never expected. "Your husband, he hired me." I froze, every nerve in my body going numb. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He ran a hand through his hair, avoiding my gaze. "I'm a private investigator. Eric hired me a few months ago. He wanted to make sure everything was okay. That you were happy, faithful." His words cut through me like a knife, each one deeper than the last. I could barely breathe as his confession sank in. This whole time, the passion, the connection, the nights I thought were just for us, it had all been a job. A cold, calculated job to test my loyalty. Betrayal washed over me in waves, blurring my vision as tears began to fall. But this, us, I choked out, unable to form a coherent thought. He reached out, his fingers brushing my cheek, and for a moment I saw the real regret in his eyes. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I didn't expect to feel this way about you. His voice was raw, a painful admission that made the betrayal sting even more. But it was my job to follow you, get close, see if you'd stray. And somewhere along the way, it stopped being just a job for me. The words hung between us, empty and heavy all at once. I pulled away from him, my mind racing with the realization that the one thing I thought was real, the one part of my life that had felt genuine, was nothing more than a lie. He'd been sent to test my loyalty, to tempt me, to push me to a breaking point, and I had fallen for it, fallen for him. I stumbled away, unable to look back, feeling as if my entire world had shattered in an instant. The guilt, the lies, the nights I'd spent by his side. All of it crushed me, the weight of my choices finally coming down in a painful, unbearable truth. I returned home that night feeling hollow, my marriage in shambles, my heart broken by a stranger I'd never really known. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog, thick and relentless, weighing down every step. Eric sensed something was wrong. I could see it in his cautious glances, the subtle way he avoided talking too much, as if afraid of what might spill out if he asked. But he didn't know the whole truth, not yet. Every time I caught him looking at me, the guilt twisted in my stomach, a sick reminder of how far I'd let things spiral out of control. Daniel haunted me in ways I hadn't anticipated. His words echoed in my mind at every silent moment, replaying the betrayal, the bitter realization that I'd let myself be deceived. I hated him for what he'd done, for how easily he'd slipped into my life, pretending to care, pretending that we had something real. And worse, I hated myself for still feeling something for him, even knowing everything was built on lies. One evening as I was heading home from work, I felt an all too familiar tension in the air, a chill running down my spine, the sense of being watched. I glanced around, half expecting to see Daniel lurking in the shadows, a shadow among shadows. And just when I thought I'd imagined it, I caught sight of him on the other side of the street, leaning against a lamppost, watching me with that same intense gaze that had once drawn me in. My heart raced, both with anger and a strange thrill I hated myself for feeling. "Why are you here?" I whispered as he approached, his footsteps soft and measured, the same casual grace he'd shown on our nightly runs. "Because I can't stay away," he replied, his voice low and conflicted, almost pleading. "I know it's too much to ask for forgiveness, but you have to know. I'm sorry." His words felt hollow, empty compared to the whirlwind of emotions still churning inside me. "You lied to me," I spat, the bitterness rising as tears stung my eyes. "Every word, every touch. You were just doing your job." He ran a hand through his hair, the faint hint of desperation breaking through his usual calm demeanor. "At first, yes. But it changed, Claire. You have to believe that." I shook my head, unwilling to let him twist my heart any further. "How am I supposed to believe anything you say now? You were sent to catch me in a lie, and that's exactly what you did. Congratulations. You can go tell my husband he was right." His eyes darkened, a mix of pain and something that looked eerily close to regret. "It's not that simple, Claire. I can't tell him, I haven't told him. Because this stopped being about him the moment I met you." He looked away, his jaw tight. "I'm not proud of what I did, but I fell for you in a way I never expected." His confession hung between us, raw and bare, stirring up emotions I wanted desperately to ignore. Part of me wanted to turn and leave, but another part, the part that had spent endless nights yearning for something, someone who understood me, held me there rooted in place. I wanted to scream, to yell, to tell him how much he'd broken me, but the words wouldn't come. Instead I whispered, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" He let out a shaky breath, as if he'd been holding it in for days. "Because I was afraid. Of losing you, of destroying what little trust you might still have left in me. And because the truth was uglier than any lie I could have told you." I looked away, trying to gather my thoughts, my heart torn between anger and longing. It's too late, Daniel. Whatever you thought we had, it was ruined the second you decided to manipulate me. Without waiting for his response, I turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. I didn't want to look back, didn't want to see the pain on his face because deep down I knew it mirrored my own. But as I reached the corner, I heard his voice, low and broken. I love you, Claire. The words hit me like a punch, freezing me in place. For a split second, I thought of turning around, of giving in to the tangled mess of emotions that had consumed us both. But the betrayal, the lies, the gut-wrenching guilt, it was all too much. I kept walking, leaving him in the shadows, even as my heart shattered with every step. In the days that followed, I tried to immerse myself in work, in the mundane routine of life, hoping the emptiness would fade. Eric continued to act like nothing was wrong, still the same loving, attentive husband he'd always been. But his kindness now felt like a twisted reminder of my own failure. One evening, he surprised me with a bouquet of white lilies, my favorite. He'd always remembered the smallest details, things I often overlooked in the haze of my discontent. I just thought, you could use something beautiful, he said softly, pressing the flowers into my hands. His eyes held a warmth I didn't deserve, a trust I'd shattered. And yet, there he was, blissfully unaware of the betrayal that lingered in the silence between us. I managed a smile, swallowing back the guilt that threatened to choke me. Thank you, Eric, I whispered, my voice barely steady. They're beautiful. He leaned in, his lips brushing my forehead, and for a moment I wished I could rewind, undo every poor choice, every mistake. But reality remained, and as he pulled away, his gaze lingered on mine, a hint of something deeper flickering in his eyes. Is everything all right? He asked, his tone laced with concern. I forced another smile, nodding quickly. Of course. Just work's been stressful. The lie felt bitter, clinging to my tongue like poison. I hated myself for every word, every pretense. Eric's gaze softened, his hand resting on my shoulder in that gentle, comforting way that had once been enough. If you ever need a break, a vacation, anything, just let me know. We can take a trip, clear our heads. I don't want you to feel like you're carrying everything alone. I nodded, unable to find the right words, and retreated to the bedroom, where I sank onto the bed, clutching the lilies as if they might somehow cleanse me of my sins. But there was no escaping the choices I'd made, no easy way to undo the damage. And as I sat there in the dark, I felt the weight of my actions pressing down, a constant reminder of the person I'd become. Weeks passed, and though I tried to forget Daniel, his presence lingered like a ghost, haunting my thoughts and dreams. I would see flashes of him in crowds, catch the scent of his cologne, feel the phantom touch of his hand on mine. It was maddening, a constant reminder of the brief, reckless connection we'd shared. And yet I couldn't shake him, couldn't erase the feelings that had once felt so real. One afternoon, as I was leaving work, I saw him standing by my car waiting. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of determination and vulnerability that made my heart skip a beat. I wanted to turn around to walk away, but he called my name, his voice filled with a desperation that stopped me in my tracks. Please, Claire. Just hear me out. Against my better judgment, I nodded, allowing him to follow me to a nearby coffee shop, where we sat in tense silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavy between us. I know I don't deserve a second chance, he began, his gaze fixed on his hands, but I can't let you go without trying. I fell for you, Claire, despite everything, despite the job, the lies. You became more than a job. I was reckless and selfish, but every word I said to you was real. I looked away, feeling the anger and longing warring within me. How am I supposed to believe that, Daniel? You were hired to test me, to manipulate me. How do I know any of this is real? He reached across the table, his hand covering mine, his touch sending a jolt through me. Because I'm here. Because I'm willing to risk everything just to be with you. I know I messed up, but I want to make things right. Let me prove it to you. Tears stung my eyes, the ache in my heart nearly unbearable. Part of me wanted to believe him, to take the risk, to let him back into my life. But the betrayal, the lies, they were too much to forget. I pulled my hand away, shaking my head slowly. I can't, Daniel. You've already taken too much from me. He looked defeated, his shoulders slumping as he stood up, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored my own. Without another word, he turned and left, leaving me alone once more, the emptiness consuming me. I sat there for a long time, staring into the half-empty coffee cup, wondering if I'd made the right choice, or if I'd just let the one person who'd truly seen me walk out of my life forever. After Daniel walked out of that coffee shop, the silence he left behind felt almost deafening. My mind played tricks on me, filling in the space he'd once occupied with endless what-ifs and half-formed thoughts of regret. I tried to tell myself that I'd made the right choice, that letting him go was the only way to piece together the life I'd broken. And yet, the pull toward him lingered, like a phantom ache that I could never quite shake. The days passed in a blur, one bleeding into the next as I attempted to sink back into my routine. Work became my refuge, a place where I could bury myself in deadlines and projects, hoping to exhaust every lingering thought. At home, Eric grew more attentive, seemingly sensing my restlessness. He planned quiet dinners and movie nights, carefully molding our time together into something softer, more deliberate. And yet, despite everything, I felt the gap between us widening. One evening, after a tense, wordless dinner, he looked at me with that same probing expression he'd shown countless times recently, and I knew the questions were finally coming. "Claire," he said gently, leaning over the table, "is there something you're not telling me?" My heart skipped, panic bubbling up before I forced myself to look calm. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He sighed, the lines around his eyes deepening as he chose his words. "I don't know. You seem distracted, distant. Is it work? Is there something going on that I don't know about?" I struggled to find an answer, torn between the instinct to deny everything and the weight of the truth clawing at me. "No, it's nothing," I managed, forcing a smile. "Work's just been a lot, and I haven't been sleeping well. I'm sorry, I know I haven't been the easiest to be around." His hand reached across the table, covering mine in a gesture that was almost heartbreaking in its simplicity. "I want you to be happy, Claire. Whatever it takes, we can make it work." The sincerity in his voice cut through me, filling me with a deep sense of shame. Here was the man who had given me everything, who had been steady and constant, and I had betrayed him in the most profound way. My heart clenched painfully, but the words I knew I should say, the truth he deserved, stuck in my throat, tangled in a web of fear and regret. "I know, Eric," I whispered, feeling the guilt settle heavily on my shoulders. "Thank you." As the weeks dragged on, Daniel's absence became a kind of haunting, a constant shadow that reminded me of every mistake I'd made. I'd see a man in the distance with his same dark hair, his same build, and my pulse would spike before the realization settled in that it was only a stranger. Some days I swore I could smell his cologne in the hallways at work, or catch his voice mingling with the hum of the crowd on the street. I told myself it was all in my head, that he'd finally left me to repair what was left of my life. But even as I convinced myself of this, there was a part of me that longed to see him again, to feel his gaze, to hear his voice, even if it was only to say goodbye. One Friday evening I stayed late at the office, poring over a stack of reports, hoping to lose myself in the mindless work. The building had grown quiet, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights filling the empty spaces. I was about to head home when I saw him, standing just beyond the glass doors, waiting in the dim glow of the street lamp. My breath caught, every instinct telling me to turn back, to ignore him and let him fade into the night. But a force stronger than my rational mind propelled me forward, and before I knew it, I was outside, the cold air prickling against my skin. "Daniel," I said, my voice a mix of shock and anticipation. "What are you doing here?" His eyes met mine, weary but resolute. "I couldn't stay away," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I couldn't stop thinking about you. About us." The longing in his gaze broke down the walls I'd tried so hard to build, and before I could stop myself, I took a step closer, feeling the magnetic pull that had drawn us together from the very start. "Daniel, this has to end," I said, though even as the words left my lips, they felt hollow, a poor disguise for the yearning I couldn't hide. He reached for my hand, his touch igniting every nerve, every emotion I tried to bury. "Claire, you can lie to yourself all you want, but you can't lie to me. I know you feel it too." I pulled my hand away, the weight of my marriage, my life, pressing down on me. "You don't understand," I whispered, desperation coloring my voice. This can't go on. I can't keep betraying him like this." A flicker of pain crossed his face, but he held my gaze, refusing to let me look away. Then tell him the truth. Tell him everything. But don't punish yourself for feeling something real, Claire. The words sliced through me raw and painful as I realized the truth I'd been avoiding. I'd been punishing myself for every decision, every misstep, clinging to a marriage that I wasn't sure I wanted to save. All because I was afraid of what it would mean to let go. I'd built my life on stability, on predictability, and in doing so I'd abandoned parts of myself I hadn't even realized were missing. I don't know if I can, I admitted, my voice breaking. I don't know if I'm strong enough to lose everything. Daniel's hand rested on my shoulder, a gentle, grounding presence. You won't lose everything, Claire. You'll find yourself. But you have to be honest with him and with yourself. In that moment, standing under the dim streetlights with him, I realized the gravity of my choices. I could stay with Eric, clinging to the familiar, or I could step into the unknown, risking everything for the chance at something real, something that felt alive. And though the decision terrified me, a small part of me knew it was the only path forward. The next evening I sat across from Eric at the kitchen table, my hands trembling as I prepared to tell him everything. I'd rehearsed the words 1,000 times, but now that the moment had arrived, every sentence felt like a betrayal, a knife cutting through the carefully constructed facade of our life together. Eric, I need to talk to you, I began, my voice barely a whisper. He looked up, his eyes filled with concern, and I saw the man I'd once fallen in love with, the man who had built a life with me, brick by brick, through every hardship and joy. What is it, Claire? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. There's something I haven't been honest about, something that I've been hiding from you. His face fell, the warmth in his eyes replaced by a flicker of dread. Claire, whatever it is, we can work through it. Just tell me. The words came tumbling out, each one a painful admission that I couldn't take back. I told him about Daniel, about the nights we'd spent together, the lies I'd told, the guilt that had gnawed at me every day since. With each revelation, I watched as the hurt and betrayal settled on his face, his eyes growing distant, as if he were retreating from the truth that shattered his world. When I finished, silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. He looked down, his hands clenched into fists, and I could feel the weight of his anger, his pain pressing down on me. So this is it, he said, his voice barely audible. After everything, this is how it ends? I felt the tears streaming down my face, the sorrow and regret overwhelming me. I'm sorry, Eric, I whispered. I never meant to hurt you. I lost myself somewhere along the way, and I didn't know how to find my way back. He stood up, his face a mask of sorrow, and for a moment I thought he might reach for me, that he might forgive me despite everything. But instead he shook his head, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. You found yourself, Claire. You just forgot where you left me. The words cut through me, final and devastating, as he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the reality of the life I'd shattered. I sat there, the silence pressing in, knowing that there was no going back, that the decisions I'd made had changed everything forever. Days turned into weeks, and life became a fragile attempt at moving forward. Eric and I spoke little, the distance between us growing with every silent morning, every empty evening. He didn't leave, but the connection we'd once shared felt irreparably broken. A faint memory of what had once been. And Daniel? He remained a ghost, lingering in my mind, a reminder of everything I'd risked and lost. I often wondered if he thought of me, if he felt the same hollow ache that I did. But I knew that whatever had passed between us was over. A fleeting moment that had changed us both in ways we could never undo. In time, I learned to live with the choices I'd made, the path I'd chosen, and though the regret remained, I found a strange sense of peace in the honesty I'd fought so hard to avoid. I had lost everything, but in that loss, I had finally found the one thing I'd been searching for all along, myself. In the months that followed, the aftermath of my confession played out quietly, each day carrying a muted sense of resignation. Eric and I continued to live under the same roof, navigating around each other in a fragile, fractured dance of familiarity and distance. The home that had once been a refuge now felt haunted by unspoken words, shared glances heavy with memories, and the silent question of how we'd come to this place. It was as if we were bound together by some last thread of shared history, too stubborn or maybe too lost to let it fray entirely. Eric was polite but distant. He would come home late, staying out with colleagues or at the office until after dark, leaving me alone to listen to the echo of footsteps that no longer belonged to us. The weight of my guilt never lifted, instead settling around me like a cloak, growing heavier with each day that he kept his anger silent, every ounce of resentment pushed down beneath the mask he wore. His silence hurt more than any outburst ever could have. I could feel his pain in the spaces between us, and it only reminded me of what I had broken, of the love I had taken for granted and the life I had upended. I'd taken a leave of absence from work, partly because I could no longer handle the sympathetic or suspicious glances of coworkers who had heard only half the truth of my situation, and partly because I needed to find something beyond the daily routine that only deepened the sense of loss. I spent the mornings wandering through old haunts, the small art gallery we used to frequent, the coffee shop we had once spent Sunday mornings in, poring over newspapers and books. Each place held remnants of the life I once cherished, a bittersweet comfort that felt foreign now. I found myself wondering if Eric would ever forgive me, if forgiveness was even something he considered as he watched me from a distance, measuring every gesture, every attempt at normalcy. It was during one of these quiet mornings that I stumbled into a small bookstore, hidden in a side street I'd never noticed before. The shop was warm with shelves overflowing with books in disarray, a comforting mess that beckoned me in. I let my fingers trace along the dusty spines, finding solace in the smell of old paper and ink. A low, familiar voice interrupted my quiet sanctuary, and my heart skipped a beat. "Finding what you're looking for?" I turned sharply, the world narrowing in on the sight of Daniel standing in the aisle, a hesitant smile softening his usually intense gaze. Time felt as though it froze, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I hadn't seen him in months, hadn't even heard his voice, and yet here he was, as real and solid as if he'd been waiting in the corners of my mind all along. He looked different, slightly worn around the edges, as if the weight of everything between us had marked him just as deeply as it had me. "Daniel," I whispered, my voice barely holding steady. "What are you doing here?" He took a step closer, his gaze softened, but that same haunted intensity lingered, the way it always had. "I've been coming here a lot recently. It's one of the few places that reminds me of you. I hoped somehow that I might see you again." A rush of emotions flooded through me. Anger, sadness, longing, and something else I couldn't quite place. I had convinced myself that seeing him would only deepen the wound, that he would be nothing but a painful reminder of my mistakes. And yet now, standing here, I couldn't look away. "I thought you'd left," I managed, my voice catching on the words. "After everything, I thought you'd moved on." He laughed, though it held little humor. "I tried. Believe me, I tried. But some things, some people, they don't just disappear. And no matter what happened, I couldn't stop thinking about you." He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to give you space. I know I hurt you, and I didn't want to complicate things more than I already had." The raw honesty in his voice cut through me, reigniting feelings I'd tried so hard to bury. Despite everything, the betrayal, the guilt, the destruction we'd wrought, I couldn't deny the pull that still lingered between us, the connection that had felt so impossible to sever. Standing in that dusty bookstore, it felt like a small piece of the world was ours again, a hidden corner untouched by the past. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, feeling my defenses falter. "Everything feels so broken now. I don't even know who I am anymore." He reached for my hand, his touch grounding, warm, his eyes filled with a sincerity that was painfully familiar. "Then let's figure it out together. I don't expect anything, Claire, but maybe we can help each other heal." A part of me resisted, still clinging to the hurt and betrayal that had torn us apart. And yet, another part, the part that still remembered the stolen nights, the laughter, the intimacy that had once felt like salvation, wanted to believe him, wanted to let him in. I nodded slowly, allowing myself, for the first time, to admit that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way forward. In the weeks that followed, Daniel and I began meeting in that small bookstore, always under the pretense of friendship, though we both knew it was more than that. Our connection was different now, tempered by the pain and regret we'd caused, but it was real in a way that felt grounding, steady. I told him about the empty silence at home, about Eric's quiet anger, the life we continued to navigate out of some last thread of obligation. And Daniel listened, never offering empty reassurances or shallow comforts, but simply listening, bearing witness to the mess I'd made of my life. Slowly, our conversations grew longer, deeper, venturing beyond the pain and regret. We talked of dreams, of old passions we'd abandoned somewhere along the way. He'd once been a musician, he told me, a fact I'd never known. And on the rare occasions when the bookstore was quiet, he'd hum softly, the notes filling the air with a warmth that felt like a balm to my fractured heart. One evening he brought a guitar to our meeting, his fingers moving gracefully over the strings as he played an old song, his voice low and rich, filling the small space with a kind of intimacy that left me breathless. I closed my eyes, letting the music wash over me, feeling the weight of my choices lift, if only for a moment. In those stolen hours we created a fragile sanctuary, a place untouched by the past, where I could forget, if only briefly, the life that waited for me outside. But the reality of my marriage remained, an ever-present shadow that grew heavier with each passing day. Eric's silence had become impenetrable, a wall I couldn't break through, and no matter how hard I tried, I knew that our love, once so strong, had frayed beyond repair. One evening, as I sat across from him at the dinner table, I felt the finality settle over me, a quiet realization that there was no going back. "Eric," I began, my voice trembling, "we need to talk." He looked up, his eyes weary but resigned, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. He set down his fork, folding his hands as he waited for me to continue. "I can't keep pretending that everything's okay," I said softly, the weight of the truth finally coming to rest on my shoulders. "We've both been holding on to something that's no longer there. And I think it's time we let each other go." He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, the lines of hurt and sorrow etched deep into his face. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've known for a while. I just didn't want to admit it." The room grew quiet, the finality settling over us as we both processed the words that had changed everything. We spoke long into the night, sorting through the remnants of our life together, the memories we'd once held so dear, acknowledging the love we'd shared, even as we accepted that it was no longer enough. In the days that followed, we began the slow process of disentangling our lives, packing up the pieces of a marriage that had run its course. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, a modest space that felt both liberating and terrifying. I was alone for the first time in years, adrift in the quiet uncertainty of this new chapter. Daniel visited often, bringing warmth and companionship, a gentle presence that filled the lonely spaces in my life. We took things slowly, each step forward marked by caution and respect for the past we'd both left behind. The pain and guilt still lingered, but there was a tentative hope blooming between us, a quiet understanding that, despite everything, we'd found something real in the wreckage. One evening, as we sat on the floor of my apartment, sharing a bottle of wine and laughing over stories of our pasts, I looked at him, feeling a warmth I hadn't known in years. "Do you ever think about how we ended up here?" I asked, my voice soft. He smiled, his gaze meeting mine with a tenderness that felt like home. "Every day," he replied. "And every day I'm grateful that we did." In that moment I felt a quiet certainty settle over me, a fragile peace that had eluded me for so long. I knew our path had been far from perfect, marked by mistakes and regret, but somehow we had found our way through the darkness, emerging on the other side with a newfound understanding of ourselves, of each other, of the love we were finally free to share. For the first time in a long time I felt whole. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel and I settled into a rhythm that felt strangely like normalcy. A kind of delicate dance that was both new and familiar, cautious yet filled with a quiet excitement that kept me grounded. My small apartment became our sanctuary, a place where we could let down our guards, away from the eyes of the world and the judgment I feared was still out there, waiting for me. The transition from a life with Eric to one where I was learning who I was on my own was difficult. Some days I would find myself wandering through rooms filled with unfamiliar furniture, the colors and textures different from what I'd once shared with Eric. It was both liberating and heartbreaking. Sometimes I'd reach for my phone to send him a text about a funny thought or a new recipe I'd tried, only to realize that those moments were gone, that sharing them with him would only deepen the pain we were both trying to move past. Yet, amid the loneliness of those moments, Daniel became my anchor. He understood the hesitation in my smile, the days when I felt like retreating back into myself. Our relationship was no longer the clandestine thrill it had once been. It was deeper now, tempered by the knowledge of what we had risked, what we had lost, and the painful honesty that had ultimately brought us together. I began to trust him, not in a fleeting way but in a way that felt like building something real, one careful moment at a time. One evening after work, he surprised me with a small envelope. I eyed him suspiciously, a smile playing on my lips. "What's this?" He shrugged, that familiar mischievous glint in his eyes. "Just open it." Inside, I found 2 tickets to a small outdoor music festival in a nearby town. A place neither of us had been before. I looked up and he grinned. "Thought we could use a change of scenery. Somewhere just for us. No history, no memories. Just us." His words warmed me in a way I hadn't expected. There was something beautiful about the idea of creating new memories, free from the weight of everything that had come before. So that weekend we packed up my little car with blankets, snacks, and a sense of adventure I hadn't felt in years. The festival was tucked away in a secluded area outside town, a sprawling field dotted with food trucks, brightly lit tents, and crowds of people swaying to the music. We found a spot near the back, laying out our blankets and settling in under a sky painted with stars. The air was thick with the scent of summer, wildflowers, and the faint aroma of food from the vendors around us. As the music filled the air, Daniel pulled me close, his arms wrapping around me as we sank into the rhythm of the night. There was something timeless about it, the way we fit together, as if all the pain and uncertainty had been worth it just to arrive at this moment. I leaned back, resting my head on his shoulder, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong against my back. "Do you ever think about the future?" I asked softly, my voice barely rising above the music. He was quiet for a moment, as if weighing his answer. "I think about it all the time," he replied, his voice a gentle murmur. "But I try not to overthink it. I just know that I want you in it." His words wrapped around me like a promise, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek, a mix of relief, joy, and a lingering sadness for the life I'd left behind. He noticed, gently wiping it away with his thumb, his gaze never leaving mine. "I know it's not easy," he whispered, understanding without me needing to explain. "But we're here now. And that's all that matters." As the final song drifted over the crowd, he pulled me to my feet, twirling me around in the soft grass, our laughter mingling with the fading notes. Under the vast sky, surrounded by strangers, I felt a freedom that was both exhilarating and humbling. It was as if we had taken all the broken pieces of our pasts and, in each other's arms, found a way to put them back together. The following months were a journey of rebuilding and rediscovery, a delicate process of laying down new roots while still holding on to the lessons of the past. Eric and I had finally formalized our separation, our conversations now polite but distant, each of us treading carefully around old wounds. We hadn't spoken since the papers were finalized, and though I still thought of him often, I knew that part of my life was closed now, a bittersweet chapter in a story that had moved on. With Daniel, I found myself embracing the simple joys, the quiet mornings with coffee and conversation, the shared moments of laughter and comfort. He encouraged me to rediscover parts of myself I had neglected, small passions I had set aside over the years. I took up painting again, filling my small apartment with canvases and brushes, creating abstract pieces that were messy and imperfect, but somehow reflected the beauty of everything we'd been through. One night, as I sat cross-legged on the floor, covered in paint, Daniel watched me with a soft smile. "I don't think I've ever seen you this happy," he said, his voice filled with an admiration that made my heart swell. I looked up, feeling a blush rise to my cheeks. "I don't think I've ever felt this free," I admitted, realizing how true the words were. For the first time in years, I wasn't living according to someone else's expectations or trapped by the weight of my own guilt. I was free to explore, to fail, to create, to love. One evening, just as autumn began to settle in, bringing with it a crispness to the air, Daniel took me on a surprise drive. We wound through the countryside, the trees ablaze with reds and golds, the landscape awash in the warm hues of the season. Finally, he pulled over by a small, hidden lake surrounded by trees, the surface smooth and glass-like, reflecting the sunset in a dazzling display of colors. As we stepped out of the car, he turned to me, his face serious but his eyes soft. "There's something I've wanted to say for a long time, but I wanted to wait until it felt right." My heart skipped, a nervous excitement building as he took my hands in his, his gaze never wavering. Claire, we've been through a lot together. We've seen each other at our best and our worst, and somehow we're still here. I know life isn't perfect and neither are we, but I want this. I want us. He paused, taking a deep breath, his thumb brushing gently over my hand. I love you, Claire. And whatever the future holds, I want to face it with you. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only his words echoing in the cool evening air. I felt the tears again, not of sadness, but of the overwhelming joy and gratitude for this man who had come into my life when I least expected it, who had shown me a love that was both flawed and beautiful, real and redemptive. I love you too, Daniel, I whispered, feeling the weight of the words settle warmly between us, grounding us in a promise that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. In that moment by the quiet lake under the fiery colors of the setting sun, I felt as if every choice, every hardship, every painful step had led me here to this new beginning. Our journey had been anything but traditional, marked by mistakes and moments of weakness, but it was ours. And as he pulled me into his arms, holding me close against the chill of the evening, I knew that this was the life I had been searching for all along. A life built not on perfection but on acceptance, on the kind of love that saw all the broken pieces and chose to stay. We stood there in silence, holding each other as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in twilight. And for the first time I felt at peace, a quiet contentment settling over me, knowing that whatever came next, I would face it with him by my side. As the seasons shifted from autumn to winter, Daniel and I continued to build our life together, piece by piece, letting each day settle into a rhythm that was both tender and grounding. The quiet joy I found in our simple routines began to feel like home, a comforting warmth that wrapped around us, even as the snow began to fall and the world outside grew colder. Our little apartment became our haven, a place of laughter, late-night talks and endless cups of tea by the window as we watched the city lights flicker in the distance. We filled the space with memories, each one like a small token of the life we were creating together. I painted more than I had in years, my canvases growing in number and boldness, spilling out of the bedroom and into the living room, where Daniel would often watch me, his presence quiet and supportive. He joked that one day we'd run out of wall space, but he never asked me to stop. Instead, he encouraged me to keep creating, his gentle enthusiasm adding a layer of purpose to the work I poured my soul into. One evening, as a light snow began to fall outside, Daniel came home carrying a small pine tree, its green branches dusted with tiny flecks of snow. He had a shy smile on his face, and I could tell he was uncertain, as if worried about whether I'd embrace the tradition he was proposing. I thought we could have a tree this year, he said, setting it down in the corner of the room. Maybe start our own traditions. His words struck a chord in me, filling me with an unexpected warmth. The idea of building something new, of creating memories that were ours alone, felt like a gift. I nodded, a smile spreading across my face as I helped him decorate the tree with simple, handmade ornaments we crafted from bits and pieces we found around the apartment. Paper snowflakes, bits of ribbon and dried flowers we'd saved from a summer picnic. Each ornament held a small story, a reminder of the moments we'd shared. As we stood back to admire our creation, he wrapped his arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. It's perfect, he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet pride that made my heart ache in the best way. It really is, I agreed, feeling a swell of happiness that was both humbling and profound. In January, with the holiday decorations carefully packed away and the snow covering the city in a soft white blanket, we began discussing our dreams, our plans, the small hopes we'd held onto through everything. One evening over dinner, Daniel mentioned a place he'd always dreamed of visiting, a small coastal town he'd read about, nestled along the rocky shores of Maine, where the waves crashed against cliffs and the sky stretched out, vast and open. His eyes lit up as he described it, his voice taking on a wistful tone. Maybe one day we could go there, he said, looking up, his gaze meeting mine with a hint of excitement. I smiled, feeling his enthusiasm draw me in, warming me against the chill of the winter night. I'd love that, I replied softly. Let's make it happen. We can save up, plan it out. Something to look forward to. The idea took root, growing into a shared dream we nurtured together over the following weeks. We spent countless nights researching the town, making lists of places to visit, little restaurants we wanted to try, and trails we hoped to hike. It was the first time in a long time that I felt excited about the future, that I looked forward to what lay ahead with a sense of purpose and joy. One evening in early spring, after weeks of planning, we decided it was time to take a small step toward making our dream a reality. We packed our bags for a short weekend getaway to a nearby lake, a quiet retreat nestled within a forest. It wasn't the coastal town we dreamed of, but it was a chance to escape the city, to breathe in the fresh air and surround ourselves with nature. The cabin we rented was simple, with a small fireplace and a cozy sitting area overlooking the lake. As we settled in, the peacefulness of the place began to wash over us, leaving behind the worries and stresses of city life. That evening we took a walk along the lakeshore, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. We held hands, our footsteps soft against the damp earth, the quiet between us filled with a sense of contentment. As we walked, he turned to me, his gaze softening. "Being here with you, it feels like a new beginning," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. I smiled, squeezing his hand. "It does, doesn't it?" The weekend passed in a blur of quiet moments and small adventures, hiking along trails, sitting by the lake with cups of coffee in the early morning, watching the mist rise from the water. We laughed and shared stories, peeling back layers of each other's pasts, discovering little details we'd never taken the time to share. I learned about his childhood, his early dreams of becoming a musician, his favorite books and songs. And I shared my own dreams, the ones I'd forgotten, the passions I'd left behind as life took me in directions I hadn't anticipated. On our last night there, we sat by the fireplace, a soft glow illuminating the room. He pulled out a small notebook, flipping through the pages before handing it to me. I opened it, my heart skipping a beat as I saw his neat handwriting filling the pages. Each entry was a small note, a memory, a thought he'd jotted down about us, moments I had thought were fleeting, but that he had carefully recorded, as if each one held a deeper meaning. "These are beautiful," I whispered, feeling my throat tighten. He smiled, his gaze warm. "I wanted to remember every part of this journey with you. Every step, every laugh. It's all here because it matters to me." A tear slipped down my cheek, and he reached out, brushing it away with a tenderness that made me feel safe, cherished. I closed the notebook, setting it down as I leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my cheek. In that quiet moment, I realized that our story, though marked by mistakes and regrets, was also filled with love, resilience, and an understanding that few ever found. As the months passed, life settled into a gentle rhythm, one marked by trust, growth, and a shared commitment to building something lasting. I found myself investing more deeply in my art, exhibiting a few pieces in local galleries with Daniel's encouragement. He was my biggest supporter, always standing by my side, his pride in me evident with each success, no matter how small. We began talking about our future in more tangible terms, about the kind of life we wanted to build, the places we hoped to see, the dreams we would chase together. It was a future that felt like ours, untethered to the expectations of the past, free from the mistakes that had once defined us. One day while we were out on a walk, Daniel stopped suddenly, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Have you ever thought about moving somewhere quieter?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze intense. I looked at him, surprised. "Like leaving the city?" He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Maybe a place with more space. Somewhere we could build a life that's just ours." The idea took root, growing into a dream that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. We began exploring small towns, visiting places on weekends, each trip filled with a sense of possibility. Each place we visited felt like a new beginning, a chance to rewrite our story in a way that was entirely our own. One summer evening, as we sat on the porch of a small cottage we'd rented for the weekend, Daniel took my hand, his gaze serious but filled with a quiet joy. "Claire," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I want you to know that no matter where life takes us, you are my home. You are my beginning and my end, my choice every single day." Tears filled my eyes as I took in his words, each one a balm to the wounds I'd carried, a promise that soothed the insecurities I had yet to let go of. "And you are mine," I whispered, feeling the weight of the past lift, replaced by the warmth of a future that felt both uncertain and beautifully possible. In that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to peek through the darkening sky, I realized that we had created something rare, something worth holding on to. Our journey had been far from perfect, but it had led us here, to a place where we could be vulnerable, honest, and fully ourselves. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly deeply at peace, knowing that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. The years would come and go, bringing with them challenges, triumphs, and countless moments of quiet joy. But in each of those moments I would remember this beginning, this promise that we had made to each other, to choose love, to embrace imperfection, and to build a life that was wholly beautifully ours.